third time I'm presenting this paper, so all comments and suggestions will be very welcome. Let's start with some existing studies on political connections. So basically, previous studies have found both benefits and costs of political connections on firms. So on the one hand, political connections can bring firms more access to financing, preferential regulatory treatment from the government, and also lower tax rates. And that's summarized as the 10% theory of political connections. On the other hand, studies also find connecting firms can have higher political risk and worse corporate governance. So basically, the overall evidence on the effect of political connections is still mixing. And also, most studies in this area have been focusing on the connections from block holders and executives instead of independent directors. But in China, actually, it was quite common, it was quite popular for firms to appoint government officials as independent directors. And although this kind of politically connected independent directors, or PCIDs, can help firms to build political connection, it can also distort the original role independent directors play in firms' government. So in this paper, I try to extend the existing research by focusing on these PCIDs. And the anti-corruption campaign actually provided a good laboratory for this kind of study. So in a study from 2013, the Chinese government started a massive anti-corruption campaign. And during this campaign, a new regulation called Regulation Number 18 was issued. Basically, this new regulation prohibits all government officials from taking any part-time positions in firms. So after the release of this new regulation, these PCIDs actually the largest group affected by this regulation. Because as I just said, it was quite common for government officials to serve as independent directors. And after this regulation, these PCIDs would have to resign to leave the firm. So, but another feature of this regulation is that it does not require these PCIDs to resign immediately in order to maintain the normal operation of the firms. So we actually witnessed a wave of PCID resignation in the following 2 to 3 years. And using this regulation as a shock, I examined how Chinese listed firms are affected. First, I find firms with these PCIDs suffer negative cumulative abnormal return around the release of this regulation. So basically, firm value decreased because of this regulation. And now it comes to the question, why firm value decreased? So thinking about the basic stock pricing formula, the decrease in stock price can either because of the decrease in cash flow in the numerator, or the increase in discount rate of firm risk in the denominator. So one possibility is that after such a regulation, firms may lose PCIDs and thus may have worse operating performance, which leads to less future cash flow. And I call this the cash flow explanation. And another possibility is that after such a regulation, these firms actually increase in political risk. Because as I just said, these PCIDs do not resign immediately. So before they leave the firm, they are voluntary to government investigations, so they may have higher political risk. So that leads to higher discount rates and thus decreasing firm value. And I call this the political risk explanation. And to address this issue, I further test firms' value change around the recognition of these PCIDs. So I see how the firm value changed when these PCIDs actually resign. And I find that firm value actually increase, or they have positive comp around these resignations. So that's actually consistent with the political risk story. Basically, after the resignation of these PCIDs, the firms might decrease in political risk. And so they have higher firm value. And next, I further test the change of operating performance and firm risk. And I find actually firms' operating performance doesn't change much after their PCIDs resign, but they indeed decrease in firm risk. And this provides further support for the cash flow, for the political risk explanation instead of the cash flow story. And also, I find replacing PCIDs improves firms' governance, especially for SOEs, state-owned enterprises. So my study tries to contribute to the literature in several ways. So first, while previous studies find various benefits of political connections, I find that political connection also brings firms more political risk. And the abnormal reason also suggests that the political risk is priced by Chinese investors. And also the effect of political connections is contingent on firms' ownership structure. So the effect of losing PCIDs is different for state-owned enterprises and non-state-owned enterprises. And the results also provide further support for further evidence that political connections are associated with worse corporate governance. And it also suggests that the improvement in governance also suggests that the anti-corruption campaign in China is quite effective. My study is also different from some existing studies on this area in the China's anti-corruption campaign. Basically, the Ding et al. 2017 and Lin et al. 2016 paper, they both look at the effect of corruption in certain groups, but I look at the effect of political connections in this campaign. And although that Liu et al. 2018 paper, they look at similar stuff, but they only investigate the value effect around the release of this regulation, but not the effect of the real recognition of the PCIDs. And also, they don't investigate the mechanisms of the decreasing firm value. So next, I'll go through the main body of the paper, starting from hypotheses. The first, I propose firms with PCIDs decreasing firm value after release of such a new regulation. And as I just mentioned, I have two alternative explanations for the decreasing firm value. If the firm loses the benefits of political connections, they may have worse operating performance, which leads to lower cash flow and thus lower firm value. And if this cash flow explanation holds, firm value should not change around the announcement of PCID recognition, because this information is already incorporated in the stock price decrease when the regulation initially was released. And of course, firms should have worse operating performance in the future. And on the other hand, if the political risk explanation holds, firms should have higher firm value when these PCIDs actually resign. And of course, they should have lower firm risk in the future. And I also propose corporate governance improves after replacing PCIDs. So basically, board monetary efficiency should increase, and there's less management entrapment, and less expropriation from controlling shareholders, and also less endowment and traveling costs from the executives. Next, the data and identification. So in order to identify these PCIDs, I first collect the independent director recognition reports from January 2013 to May 2017. So in these reports, the firm sometimes states the reason of this independent director resignation. So if they state the independent director resigned in order to comply with this regulation, identify this independent director as being politically inactive. And for the other resigning independent directors who do not state the reason, I further look at their background profiles in annual reports and identify them as PCID if they are current or former government officials, members of the People's Congress, or members of People's Consultative Conference. And this is actually the most popular, commonly used definition of political connection in the literature. And by doing this, I construct a sample of 418 treated firms that have PCID resignations. And I also use the one-to-one propensity score matching to find another 418 firms as a control group. And I have three sets of event dates in the study. The first, of course, is the release date of the new regulation. And the second is the announcement date of each PCID resignation. So as I just said, I will also test the value effect when these PCID announce their resign. And this actual resignation date can be different for different firms, because apparently these PCIDs don't resign at the same time. And the third one is the actual leaving date of each PCID. So this is about the requirement in China. So basically, listed firms in China are required to have at least 1/3 independent director sitting on the board. So if the recognition of this PCID leads to less than 1/3 body independency, this recognition will not be effective until a new independent director is appointed in a shareholder meeting. So that means even if PCIDs announce their recognition, they will still be officially on the board until the next shareholder meeting. So I will use this stage to examine the change of firm's operating performance and the firm risk, because this is the actual date they are leaving the firm. And for the data source, the SysMA is most commonly used database for China's financial research, and I collect the resignation reports and annual reports from the websites of the Shanghai Stock Exchange and Shenzhen Stock Exchange. So next we come to the empirical results. So first, the firm value of the market reaction to the release of the regulation. First, we calculate the cumulative abnormal return occur for the traded firms around the release of the regulation using the market model over different event windows. And we can see actually the traded firms have a negative cumulative abnormal return after the release of this regulation. And that's actually consistent with the first hypothesis that firm value decreased because of this regulation. And if we look at the first two short event windows, we can find it's actually not quite significant. And one potential reason I'm thinking that is because the new regulation was initially distributed to some certain government agencies and institutions throughout the internal administrative system, which may cause delay of the dissemination of this message or information through the market. And further run the cross-sectional regression using the CAR as a dependent variable and this PCID as an independent variable. So PCID is basically a dummy variable if the firm is in the treatment group, and 0 if it's in the control group. And also control for a bunch of firm characteristics and the industry fixed effects. You can see the coefficients on this treatment dummy are all significantly negative. So that basically means these traded firms have higher or have more negative return than the controlled firms after the release of this regulation. And next, I further look at the market reaction around the PCID resignations. So I again calculate the cumulative abnormal return, and we can see the traded firms have very large and significantly positive abnormal return. So that means they're increasing firm value while this PCID is actually resigning. And if you look at the cross-sectional regression results, they are quite consistent. So the coefficients are all significantly positive. So that actually provides support for the political risk explanation. So basically, after these PCIDs resign, the firms are compliant with the regulation, so they may have lower political risk, which can lead to high firm value. And if we further look at the subsample analysis, we can find the non-SOEs actually have quite larger CAR than the SOEs. To address this issue, I further run the cross-sectional regression using these two subsamples. And I find that the coefficients in the SOE subsample are not significant, although they are still positive. But for the non-SOEs, they're significantly positive and quite large. So that basically means these non-SOEs may have larger decrease in political risk and thus larger increase in firm value. And I will actually come back to this issue when I check the change in firm risk. So basically, the previous results suggest that the firm value decreased after such a regulation, but they increased back when the PCIDs resign. And that's probably because of the change in political risk. And next, I'll further look at the change of operating performance and firm risk. So first, I use return equity and the cash flow from operations to measure operating performance. And the regression models is the typical diff regression model. So the PCID is the treatment dummy, and post is a dummy variable, which is equal to 1 after the PCIDs leave the firm, and 0 otherwise. And I have some other firm characteristics and the control variables, and also the industry and year fixed effects. So if we look at the main interest variable, the interaction term here, all the coefficients are actually not significant. That basically suggests that the operating performance doesn't change much after these PCIDs are replaced. And of course, I use many other variables to measure operating performance, including return equity or return asset and the total cash flow, and I find quite consistent results. So basically, operating performance doesn't change, so probably the future cash flow stay consistent after the PCID is refined. And next, I test whether firm risk change. So initially, I actually want to test the change of political risk. But as suggested in many studies, it's actually quite difficult to directly measure and observe the political risk. So I will follow a JFE paper using stock price volatility to first measure the change of firm risk. So the idea is that the political risk is also part of the firm's overall risk. So if political risk is decreased, then it's probably the firm risk will also decrease. So we can see in the regression results, the traded firms tend to decrease in firm risk, but the decrease is only significant for the non-SOEs. And that's actually consistent with the previous abnormal return analysis. So previously I have shown the abnormal return is much more significant for non-SOEs. And now we see they have larger decrease in firm risk. And the reason I'm thinking for the different results is that these SOEs, they may have many sources of political connections because of their ownership structure. So even their PCIDs resign, their political connection may be not affected much. But for these non-SOEs, they actually most of them may not have alternative political connections. So after these PCIDs resign, they may decrease much in political connection and political risk. I also try to use another variable to prove the firm's political risk. So this political sensitivity measure is the sum of the absolute cumulative abnormal return over the 3-day window around the announcement of new documents issued by China's Securities Regulatory Commission. So this CSRC is the main regulatory body of China's stock market. And the idea is that if the stock price is very sensitive to the regulation of this CSRC, then it might have higher sensitivity to policy or higher political risk. And using this, I find consistent results. So basically, the non-SOEs decrease significantly in policy and political sensitivity. And the previous result basically means the cash flow or the operating performance doesn't change much, but they decrease significantly from risk. And this may also mean the PCIDs, politically connected independent directors, may not bring much benefits to firms. They may actually increase firms' risk. And at last, I test the change of corporate governance. So I use the independent director business to measure firms' monitoring efficiency, because apparently busy independent directors, they're not efficient monitors, as suggested in previous studies. So we can see the traded firms tend to decrease in this business after their PCIDs resign. But the subsample analysis shows that decrease is only significant for the SOEs. I further use executive compensation to measure management detachment, and I find quite similar results. So the SOEs decrease significantly in executive compensation. And using the related party transaction to measure the expropriation on minority shareholders, I find quite similar results. So SOEs decrease significantly in related party transaction. And if you look at the entertainment and traveling costs, you have the same results. So SOEs decrease much in the entertainment and traveling expenses. So this set of results basically suggests that indeed firms may improve in corporate governance, but the improvement is much more prominent for the SOEs. And potential reasons I'm thinking that first, these SOEs, they may actually have much worse governance problems than non-SOEs before they replace these SOEs. So the effect may be stronger for them on the improvement of governance. And another possible reason is that one of the main targets of the anti-corruption campaign is to curb corruption in SOEs. So the effect of this regulation may be stronger for SOEs. And I conclude my presentation now. So the anti-corruption campaign basically provides a quasi-necessary experiment to examine the effect of political connections on firms. And using this as a shock, I find that firms with PCIDs decreasing firm value following the release of this regulation. And this is because of the increase in political risk. And both SOEs and non-SOEs operating performance doesn't change after this after losing their PCIDs, but they decrease in political risk, especially for non-SOEs. And replacing PCIDs can improve firms' corporate governance, and this effect is more prominent for SOEs. And this might also suggest the anti-corruption campaign in China is quite effective. And that concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to comment on a very excellent paper. And we are actually very pleased because Chang is still doing his PhD, but I think the quality of the paper, as all of you can see, it's good. So I will just briefly go through the objective of the paper, just to recap. The whole purpose of the paper was to investigate what is the effect of after introducing anti-corruption measure. In particular, there was this Regulation 18, which prohibits officials, government officials, from taking full-time or part-time positions in companies. So that was the regulation. And that was actually passed in October 19th, 2013. And so Chang was going to study the resignation on the effect of listed companies in Shenzhen and Shanghai, and which in turn will affect the firm performance. So he was actually introducing this as to study how the resignation of these directors would affect firm performance and corporate governance. So he used an event study, which was interesting because if you look at previous literature in this aspect, there were quite a number of literature done. But Chang was probably the first to use not just one data point, he actually used 3 data points to see what is actually driving the reason behind the firm changes. So, and with his regressions, he actually showed that firms with PCID have negative CAS, cumulative abnormal return, at a time when this Regulation 18 was released, so it was negative. And then the second point was actually at the announcement of resignation of the ID, there was an increase. Firm performance actually, there was a positive CAR. And then at a time when the PCID actually resigned, there was also an increase. So that was his finding. And so he actually explained that this is due to the decrease in political risk rather than the loss of future cash flow. And and he found that non-SOE was actually more affected by this event. So that was his first conclusion. Secondly, he also in his paper concluded that, of course, operating performance throughout the whole 3 time point wasn't affected at all, whether for SOE or for non-SOEs. So the second part of his his experiment, he tested some 4 different aspects of corporate governance. And he found that on these 4 aspects of corporate governance, board monitoring efficiency, management entrenchment, related party transaction, and ETC, he found that there was actually significant decrease, especially for SOE. So he concluded that the PCID resignation actually affected the corporate governance of these companies. So that was his conclusion. All right, so what is the contribution of this paper? It's actually a very readable paper. It's neat, very clean, and very clear. It's well written, I would say. And as I mentioned, there were quite a number of literature in this area, especially after 2013. Like one of the paper, of course, was actually by Bernie Yang on the general effect of anti-corruption measures on firm value, on shareholders' valuation. So it was actually more general. but very few papers actually went into deeper and look at the campaign at firm level, such as, departure of, PCID. So that's actually quite interesting. And there was only one paper that did something like that, similar to what Chang did. That was Liu Lin's Wu's paper, 2013 or 2018 paper, but that paper only studied one point. And they concluded that the effect was that there was a cash flow decrease. Okay, there was a loss of cash flow. That was their conclusion. So the contribution of this paper was that it tries to debunk that theory, to say that it's more than what you can see. It's not just loss of cash flow. Maybe there's an alternative explanation. And that was the main contribution of this paper, all right? So yeah, it's an interesting paper, but I'm just giving some suggestions. I think that there were actually two big aspects that you were trying to look into in this paper. So the first aspect, of course, is actually on the leaving of PCID on firm value. That was the first part of your paper. The second part of your paper was actually on corporate governance, which is itself a very big topic as well. Okay, so let's discuss these two parts together. All right, so the first thing is, of course, politically defined, politically connected. I think it's different in different places. So that's very important. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so the first thing is that I always look at definition and whether the definition captures, what you're going to test. So what we know is that political parties and politics actually, supposedly, in most jurisdictions, it's separated from government. All right, maybe China's situation is slightly different. All right, so I think you have to explain a little bit more. Even in China, when I ask around, generally it's only the top government officials that are supposed to have political ties. I'm not very sure whether it goes all the way down. Apparently it doesn't apply to all government officials. But Regulation 18 actually applies to all government officials. So in that sense, it's actually much wider than politically connected. Of course, the other term that you can use is actually government-linked. That might be a bit more precise, government-linked IDs, all right, rather than just politically linked. So I mean, I'm just suggesting, even if you want to use politically linked, politically connected, you may have to define it properly. Why is it like that? The background of China, which is quite different from other places, a lot of government officials also holds party affiliation. Okay, so that's something that you may want to think a little bit. And because if you look at the other paper, which is by Griffin, Liu, and Xu, they did say that the anti-corruption measure is more than just politically driven. Okay, and when they meant by politically driven is that even in China politics, there are fractions in the party, right? So if it is politically driven, then it will be targeting just one sort of, if you're closer to, for example, anti-Xi's gang, you will be more targeted, right? So that would be politically, all right? So a little bit like that, maybe you need to give a little bit of information about China politics in your paper. So yeah, because there are other papers which says that politics in China, it's not that simple. All right, second is that when you identify PCID's resonation, you use two methods. One method was actually through their resonation reason, which means that if they stated in their resonation papers that it's because of Regulation 18, okay, that's very clear. It's caused by, the passing of the Regulation 18. But the other way is that you actually looked at independent directors who resigned during that time, and if they are government official. So the converse may not be true. Okay, the converse may not be true because I may be a government official, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm resigning because of Regulation 18. Okay, yeah, I mean you're actually extending it. The first is definitely true, but the second one may not be true. So that's something that you may have to, qualify a little bit or, spend a little bit more time in this. And then there were a lot of other people, because if I look at your data, you actually found 2,217 ID resigning from 33 firms, 1,433 firms after the date, which means that there were a lot of IDs resigning, and we're not very sure why they resigned. All right, so that's also something that you may have to explain, because this was something that you found, and you only took 400 firms, which was like, within your definition. So what about the rest of the IDs who resigned during that time? What was the reason? Maybe that's something that you need to, tell us as well. So, okay, so that was about definition, definition, clarify your things. And it's a good argument, because it shows that there's more than just loss of, helping hand and that kind of thing. It can be a lot, you actually cast doubt on the cash flow explanation. So it can, it can mean, it can be an alternative argument. So I have a few suggestions. In your paper, you actually compare the performance of companies with PCID leaving after the release of this with your control group. The group that you were controlling were companies with similar characteristics, but no ID leaving. Okay, no ID leaving. And that's okay, but it's just that it would be neater if you actually compare, since you have the sample size is so big, you could have compared with firms around the same time with ID leaving, but they are non-PCID. All right, because if not, when you do your experiment, the firm that actually has PCID leaving were actually experiencing two shocks. The first shock, of course, was the passing of Regulation 18. The second shock was actually the ID leaving, which was not experienced by the control group, because the control group would be only the Regulations 18, right? So this is something for you to think a little bit, so as to make sure that they, as far as possible, also experience resignation of ID. All right, so that's something that you can think a little bit. And also there was a little bit, because it's not clear in your paper, when was the second and the third event happening. So it could have been a correction of the market. Okay, so that's possible, especially when you're comparing with companies which was already, not experiencing anything. So the base could be very low. The first time when the Regulations 18 came out was very low. And then the second time when they announced that the ID was leaving, although it's positive, but you're starting actually at the bottom, okay? Because you're comparing again with company which experienced nothing, all right? So that's something that you want to think a little bit, in terms of control group. And the other thing is, of course, you're not very, you may want to clarify as to how your political risk came about. I was just thinking about the logic. I mean, it sounds very good that there is political risk, but you're assuming that once Regulation 18 came in, there was an increase in political risk, which is a bit strange, because the law does allow the directors to resign. There was a grace period for the directors resign. So it doesn't mean that the directors were actually committing anything wrong, even if they stayed on until the resignation, right? So why should the political risk increase? So if it was because they did something wrong before the release of Regulation 18, means that the risk was already been there. So it doesn't really matter, even if subsequently they resign, right? So that's something that you may want to increase. Why was there a increase of political risk just after releasing of Regulation 18? I don't know, I'm a lawyer, so I tend to read all these things and start thinking about, all the rationale. All right, so that's something I was thinking about. And of course, the next one, I actually went to ask around some of my finance professors, my colleagues, whether can you use stock volatility risk to capture political risk? And they say it's very difficult, because in that sense, there was actually resignation of ID itself can cause volatility. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just political risk that you're capturing. So that's something that, for you to think a little bit, which I think the reviewers, if you send this paper, they may just ask, right? Okay, so that was the first part, which was just tidy up. And I think if you change your control sample, maybe that would help a little bit, okay? The next one is, of course, on corporate governance. You took 4 facets of corporate governance and look at this in this portion, which was very good. The first one is board monitoring efficiency, and you use the proxy of busyness of directors, right? So after the PCID resigned, you found that the new board was less busy. They were not holding so many directorship. But that was intuitive, because somebody resigned, if there are no replacement of new IDs, which we were not very sure, right? So you were not very sure whether there was any replacement of new ID. Definitely the board, they are not so busy, right? So that's something that you may want to think a little bit to confirm that the companies that you were studying actually had a replacement of IDs and they were less busy. And again, non-PCID coming up to the board doesn't necessarily mean that they are less busy. Okay? Being politically connected itself doesn't equate to busyness. All right, so that's something that you want to think a little bit. And just by using that as a proxy to say that the board, it has increased in, monitoring effect, I think maybe a bit too fast to conclude, because there are a lot of other reasons on board monitoring efficiency. You can say that, yes, the board is less busy, but that doesn't mean that the monitoring efficiency is increased, because it can due to the composition, the tenure of the board members, and frequency of board meeting, that will be efficiency. So you may need to add in a little bit more to conclude that there is actually board monitoring efficiency increase, right? So that's one. Then the second one that you talked about is the decrease in the executive compensation. Your reasoning was that because the PCID left, the management were less entrenched. But you sort of attributed everything to the leaving of the PCID, which I am a bit doubtful, because I think that after anti-measures came in, especially for SOEs, everybody tightened up. So whether the PCID left or not, I don't think it actually caused a lot of effect. Okay, itself doesn't cause a lot of effect. It's the overarching corruption measure that caused SOEs to tighten up everything. All right, so that's, whether it's actually contributed by the departure, because your point is that your argument was that because of the leaving of the PCID, the managers were less entrenched. All right, were less entrenched in that sense. I don't think so. They were less entrenched because of the whole political environment. All right, everybody decided not to receive so much compensation because the government says so, rather than just because of the leaving of the directors. So it's the same, you see. The next one that you actually put in is related party transactions. You argued that when they were in, when the PCID was on the board, they actually looked after the government's interests. So when they left, the government's interest was no longer, the new IDs that came in paid less attention to the government's interests. I think this is impossible, not in the context of SOEs, right? So I think related party transactions, again, doesn't include just PCID's connections or major shareholders' connection. It also includes executive. Related party includes executive. So my argument would be that it's because there were fewer executive inter-related party transactions because of the anti-corruption measure, rather than because of the leaving of the PCIDs, right? So that's the key thing, all right? And then lastly, of course, the fact that only SOEs are affected, but not the non-SOEs in all your 4 aspects may actually show that the PCIDs are, they are just tokens. Whether they were there or not doesn't really matter. I mean, I could actually argue the other way around, right? There wasn't, they're just token on the board, and the presence and absence has no effect on the operating performance or corporate governance. I can actually suggest that you can do one more point study and see what happens to the firm, maybe a year after, or maybe 6 months after, whether there was an increase or decrease in operating performance. And then maybe you can come up with something interesting, actually. All right? Okay, so that's a few of my comments, and we can talk a little bit more and think a little bit more on all these things. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.
For the definition of PCID, so it's actually a bit confusing because you can basically, in China, the environment is so special. You can sometimes argue many people affiliated with the government can have the political power. For example, you may even say the leader of the public universities might have this kind of political power. But that's not, that can be confusing if you define it this way, and it can be quite too complicated. So you also mentioned there are too many independent director resignations, but I only have 418 firms. This is because many of these resigning independent directors, they're actually the members of the public universities or hospitals. They're actually also affected by this regulation. But I don't include them as politically connected independent directors because I think there's no obvious reason to say these people have political connection. Like the professor in the public university, it's quite different from a classic definition of political connection. And right, for another control group, I think that's a genius idea. So I can definitely look for that because there are so many resigning independent directors. I can easily find another control group, I think. And so about the change in political risk after the release of such regulation. So I was thinking because after release of such regulation, these firms are actually more vulnerable to some government investigations if they still have these PCIDs on board. So previously, maybe these PCIDs do something wrong. They are not investigated because there is no such requirement. But after the release of such a regulation, they're actually not required. They're not allowed to sit on board. This only gives them some time to resign, but it doesn't necessarily, they will not be investigated by the government during this period. So they will have at least a higher possibility of being targeted by the government. So that's why I said there's an increase in political risk. So I think that's it. And I will take some questions. Yes, please.
So my question is what you're really testing, even if I accept your results. So suppose there was a government regulation that required football players to be put on every board, and then the regulation was changed and the football players had to leave every board, and the football players knew absolutely zero about any of these companies, but they were just sitting on the board. Would you observe the same things you observed? That is, are you testing the competence of directors or their political connections?
Right. So yes, if you say it's for the football player, maybe they will also have decrease in firm value because they can bring like some reputation asset for the firm previously.
No, I mean they just don't know anything. I'm just putting a whole bunch of people on boards who know nothing about how to run companies. That might adversely affect performance in various ways, and they might be very happy to take trips on company money. I don't, consistent with the commentary, I was unclear about the political link that caused bad performance, but it's pretty obvious that a lot of these people didn't know what they were doing when they were put on these companies, and maybe that's what you're testing. But
I also showed you that the political risk can decrease. So if you have a football player or other people, the political risk or firm risk may not change much. Even they can decrease in firm value, maybe because of other reasons.
I'm a bit puzzled by your terminology, the term PCIDs. Does the regulation you are speaking about on officials of Chinese boards mean that officials should not become independent directors or outside directors? So to put it differently, can a firm have officials as outside directors and nevertheless comply with the regulation? That makes a big difference.
Well, I'm not sure whether you talk about outside director. I think
That's an independent director.
that's
Only
that's
independent, but that is, you know, the majority, but still there may be many officials on the boards who are outside directors.
Yes, yes.
So that you should make that crystal clear, because that changes. Then you still have influence of the government on the board by these outside directors who are not independents. That changes the whole picture of your paper.
I think the law says that they cannot hold any position, salaried position. So salary, as long as you are paid. So it doesn't matter whether you are on the board, as long as you are paid, you cannot sit, you cannot be in a firm, right? So
You should make that point very clear.
Okay, thank you.
Whether you mean in general outside
Yes.
directors, or whether you mean those who we call independent. Independent is a different.
Yes, I should have made
Animal.
it more clear about the regulation and the
yeah.
definition. Yeah. Thank you.
Got a couple of thoughts. So, one, it seems like it would be useful to control what level of government the officials are in, and I would suspect that the local government officials are going to have a different impact from those that are provincial or central government officials, that you're likely to have a lot more positive benefits from having the latter type of officials. Also, I think it'd be nice to check if there were more than one official leaving. Thanks. Okay, I think I'm covered up. I think it's also interesting what you said about the university professors leaving. One wonders whether you shouldn't control for that if the firms are losing expertise because of that requirement. And then finally, I think it would be interesting to look at the characteristics of the replacement directors to see what kinds of expertise they are bringing to the table.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have some firms that have more than one PCID leaves, and I can definitely look at maybe as a subsample. Yeah, thank you.
Just another thing you might try to find, you have those two competing hypotheses. Political connectedness can be helpful, or they can try to extract rent. And then you test which one explains better the whole data. But an alternative might be to think that it has different effects in different firms, and you can partition it depending on what the firm does. So for example, if the firm provides highways in China, then political connections might be very helpful. If the firm produces chips, computer chips for Apple in America, but they don't need anything in China, their political connections might be more extracting grants. So you might try to partition the companies according to what they produce and see whether you get different effects.
Yes, that would be very interesting. Thank you.
Just another along the lines of what Alan asked. So if the political risks that you're testing is connected to being a government official, essentially meaning so you can only be investigated for corruption if you're a government official, then these people leaving automatically means that the political risk for the firm decreases. So I would like to know a little bit more about how a firm really is affected by having these people on the board, because I mean it's obvious that these people themselves are affected by corruption investigations, but how is the firm? Because that I think is relevant for the causality that you're trying to establish.
Yes, I think that relates to what the government officials can do for these firms. So basically, some studies already find if the firm has some government officials in the firm, they might have easier access to debt financing, to the bank financing, or the equity financing. They're easier to get publicly listed, and during this process, the firm may bribe these directors or give them some private benefits, and this may be considered as wrongdoing during this anti-corruption campaign, and then may make the firm vulnerable to the investigation of the government.
This follows on Lucian's comment. I think it'd be useful to use a little bit more nuanced distinction between SOE and POE. I assume you're just using an ownership cutoff, right? For that 30%, or what are you using for SOE versus POE in your sample?
Well, there's this is in the database. So the main cutoff, I guess, this is the ownership percentage. But I'm not sure how much percentage they use.
Yeah, see, this is a big problem in all these studies. It matters a lot how you're classifying these firms, and just a blunt ownership cutoff, whatever it is, it doesn't tell you very much about these firms. So I think you need to do much more to figure out how important the government is to these firms, and just using a blunt ownership cutoff in the Chinese context tells you very little.
Thank you.
Yeah, you make a lot of the difference between the SOEs and the non-SOEs. All those comparisons, you base them on the significance of a coefficient on a subsample, but you never do the comparison of whether it's significant. I mean, the difference is significant. From what I could tell, it's unlikely to be significant because the other coefficient is estimated very imprecisely. So I think you should do those tests before going too far with that distinction.
To test out the difference in coefficients.
Yeah, between the two subsamples.
Yes, thank you.
We have time for two more questions. We'll move to this side. You first.
I'm curious that after the political connected independent directors was leave, who will be replaced instead of the PCID? And I mean that it is quite easy to, taking that the straw man type and the cosmetic things. And in that case, how such a replacement increase the corporate governance. And also, more importantly, when you said improving the corporate governance, how do you expect the independent directors contribute to the corporate governance? So the even after the regulation, I understand that the majority of the board are, say, government officials or and heavily influenced by the government or at least the communist parties. And in China, or in your theory, what is independent? Independent from government, communist party, or just independent from the current CEOs? So what is the mechanism of the improving the corporate governance by independent directors?
Well, the definition of independent director is in China, if the director have lower than 0.1% of ownership, and they are not affiliated with any executives of the firm. But of course, it doesn't have any previously it doesn't have any requirement in terms of independency, whether it's independent of the government or the party. So, but studies have indeed shown that these politically connected directors, they may be have less expertise than these industry experts in terms of governing the firm. So that's one of the reasons they have worse corporate governance in these kind of firms. Another possible reason is that if you think about SOEs, these connected independent directors, they may actually know these executives in the SOEs because they are both like kind of affiliated with the government. So they may have a good relationship. So these independent directors may not put much effort on monitoring these executives. So that's what I'm thinking about the governance.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that change here. So one is the relationship between the companies and the state, and then there's the directors that play a role in that relationship. And for people who don't know that much about China, maybe you could give some illustrations of what changes actually in these two relationships. So, for example, in the German context, if you think about cars, there's the car industry having invested in diesel, so the state lowers the tax on diesel versus normal fuel, so that would be the kind of relationship that changes. But what is it in China that changes in the relationship as a result of this reform?
Well, if you, I think that's different for SOEs and non-SOEs. For the SOEs, they will be naturally naturally politically connected. So they're owned by the government. But for non-SOEs, they may not born with any political connection. They're 100% independent from the government. That's possible. But in order to grow their business, they may want to have some relation with the government. So they appoint some government officials to be their managers or independent directors. And by doing this, they're building this kind of political connection. So they have this connection with the government. And after this new regulation, this kind of connection can be cut off. So they do not have this kind of connection anymore.
Thank you very much. So, time for second paper.
Thank you.